Hello and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. This time we're going to have a short look at the concept of propaganda. So we'll start clearing some things up about propaganda itself and take a little look at the history and where the term actually comes from. Propaganda is defined as any association, systemic scheme, or concerted movement for the propagation of a particular doctrine or practice. This is actually a very neutral term, and it's also quite endemic to democratic civilizations and the way that the different forms of mass communication can allow one person to bring an idea to the forefront with any specific doctrine or practice. And there's actually a lot of what you might call good reasons for propaganda, neutral and bad reasons for propaganda. And this is why this is such a interesting topic and very important to speak about when we're speaking about public opinion, mass movements, and the modernity of human existence. But first, we're going to take a little look at the history of propaganda. Propaganda as a word first came into the English lexicon from the Vatican. Around the time of the Counter-Reformation, the shakeup of the way that the Central Catholic Church was run was desperately needed, and in order to address some of the problems that were seen, more centralization and more unification of the message which was being pushed out across the world was necessary. So a department was set up within the Vatican where various scholars and higher officials within the church came together to unify the message that should be going out and that all the priests should be preaching at the various different places where missionaries were, where priests were across the world. So in its beginning, propaganda was a single organization restructuring itself into a much more centralized and focused area in order to properly push out the message which it wanted to have as a unifying call across the world. This is a very old use of propaganda, and it didn't start to really come into play with most societies, businesses, and political associations until about the 19th century, when there was a much higher degree of centralization and a much easier spread of information for the various different nations and groups which would be using propaganda. Also in the 19th century were the invention of trains, telegraphs, mass communications, pictures, different things which allowed for messages to be distributed to a much wider audience than single people going out and speaking, which is a little bit easier to control since you can just give them a particular script or a particular set of ideas which they need to address in different topics. All of these different forms of communication and the distinction of propaganda really came to the forefront with World War I. During World War I, the military and the civilian government of the various nations involved were highly separated, and the information which was percolated down from the war front was generally controlled through the military before it even got into the politicians' hands. Because of this, there was necessarily a veil. In the last part we talked about how propaganda can only necessarily work if there's something of a veil up between the person receiving the information and the person observing the information. And this is where the concept of old propaganda comes from. Old propaganda is, we'll go a little bit more into new propaganda in a minute, but old propaganda is the idea of controlling all aspects of an event in order to properly distribute the emotions and feelings which the people on the receptive side need to feel. Because of this, on both sides, there was a necessary control of all information coming in, and this was used to discreetly guide the people in their beliefs, and it was actually incredibly effective. In fact, there is a huge distinction to be made between wartime propaganda and peacetime propaganda, and the way that the two can actually be sifted and molded. But because the first massive use of propaganda was by these large states at wartime, all of the thinkers and the intellectuals and the different people involved, Walter Lippmann was one who was part of propaganda strategies in World War I, and another guy, Edward Bernays, who we're going to talk about in this episode, was also very involved with the distribution and construction of propaganda in World War I, believed very different things about what could be done. And there was a reawakening of an old model of thinking about large groups of people, which is sometimes called the collective consciousness or the mass mind, the sort of over-swirling groupthink, if you will, of a large mass of people which dominates and overrides their individual reasonings and beliefs, which was an idea that was somewhat debunked. It is true that groups and crowds do tend to have different thought patterns, but the idea that this thought pattern can come to completely dominate a group even when they are no longer in that group was very short-lived and was taken up by a lot of extremely totalitarian regimes, which we'll look at later, and failed quite spectacularly. But out of World War I came the resurgence in this concept of propaganda. And because this propaganda had been used to necessarily manipulate millions of people into fighting a war that most of them actually didn't really have any interest in, propaganda came to have a sort of negative connotation to it, which you could argue is a good thing or a bad thing. But as Edward Bernays said, you can like or you can hate propaganda, but it is a fact of the modern technology and of the modern society that propaganda will exist. The choice isn't to say it's good or bad, the choice is to acknowledge that it exists or to ignore it. So now we're going to look at the new wave of propaganda, which arguably is still quite entrenched in our society today. You may be able to pick out what some advertisers, large corporations, social movements, and political groups are doing a little bit more acutely after you have an understanding of how this new form of propaganda works. So, one important thing to explain is that there have been two distinctive movements in advertising, and as the new propaganda began to roll into various sectors, advertising was sort of drastically changed. It was no longer an independent venture where specialists would come to companies in order to get a message out that an item needed to be bought. In the late 19th century, an advertising campaign may say, "This razor cuts extremely efficiently, very sharp. You need to buy this now." And that was an advertisement. It was trying to tell someone that there was a product, to get them to realize that something existed that they may have a need for, and to get them to purchase that specific product. It was much more in the economic conception of demand creates supply, where if you had a factory, you could only spit out so many things as people were willing to buy them. But as these various propagandists came out of the World War, they decided to begin to sell the product of what they had just been selling to the United States government to anyone that was willing to buy. There was a catch though. Nobody was really interested in propaganda because it had a very bad taste, and it was not something that people were very willing to partake in. So Edward Bernays opened up a propaganda house sometime after World War I, about the early 19 to mid 1920s, and it didn't do very well. So one day he closed his doors, and the next day he reopened his new public relations house. So propaganda is the systemic scheme or the concerted movement for the propagation of an idea or an action, and public relations is getting in touch with the public opinion to find out what it is that they want and how this can be subtly influenced to match up with what the producer, the business, the government, the social group wants. It is the bringing together of two separate interests. Before World War I, it was very easy for a factory worker to say that the public had no interest in his work and he had no interest in the public's thought. But because of the mass dissemination of information, because of the new technologies arising, and because of the public opinion-oriented civilization that rose from these democracies, it was no longer wise or even really possible for a business or any sort of large organization to completely ignore what the public thought and what it was that they wanted. So Edward Bernays was the cousin of Sigmund Freud. He came to America to establish something of a business network, and he was actually incredibly successful. He wrote a book called Crystallizing Public Opinion, and I didn't really go too much over that because Crystallizing Public Opinion is basically a plagiarization of the Lippmann book, which we went over for public opinion for the previous episode. But needless to say, he drew extensively on the thoughts of Freud for a personal psychology standpoint and from Lippmann for a source of sociological standpoint. And he was one of the most successful in the implementation of this new propaganda. Now, Edward Bernays, we'll go over a couple of things that he did to illustrate how the new propaganda works in opposition to the old propaganda, but Edward Bernays firmly believed that what he was doing was good and was right, and that propaganda could not work against the will of someone. And this became a very apparent doctrine of propaganda, especially going into the 30s and 40s, where various totalitarian regimes attempted to use propaganda to crush dissidents and different ideas, and all it actually really does is reinforce concepts within people that believe in the propaganda to begin with. Propaganda is not a constructive tool, it is simply a shaping tool, something like a boat rudder in the water. It's not going to reverse the course of the stream, but it will allow you to correct your actions and to move in the direction that you want, something that's much larger. And this is something that Edward Bernays had a very firm conception of, and he was able to repeatedly demonstrate that this was something that he knew that he could do. He believed that because there was so much information that it wasn't possible for any one person to create an accurate depiction of the world in their head, which is something that Walter Lippmann had attempted to demonstrate. And because of this, you needed to have something called a invisible government, which was actively interpreting what it was that the people actually thought and how they should emotionally and therefore physically interact with their environment. This invisible government isn't the same as something like a backroom cabal controlling the country. It's more the head of each industry, the head of different kinds of businesses, of different kinds of organizations, film creators, politicians, different people that are all at the top of various social pyramids that have an insight directly into whatever it is that they're doing, that want to create a will within the common people for whatever it is that they have and that they are offering. So, as I said, the old propaganda, the old advertising was very much about demand creates supply. And the new propaganda that we see today, that is an endemic part of our culture, is the complete opposite. It's that supply creates demand. Now, what does this mean exactly? There's a reason why our nation has to continuously grow. There's a reason why the money supply has to continuously expand. It's because most firms are actually sort of dumping their product, and it's not so much about adequately addressing a concern within the public sphere as it is about being able to seed the want for a product and then continuously producing that product in higher and higher quantities, because the only way for a company to continuously grow is to continuously produce more and more and more. And the various shocks to the economy, which have become smaller and smaller in scale, have a direct relation to the size of organizations, and the fact that 100 years ago you would have thousands of banks, and today there's like 8 major ones that control like 90% of the banking in the United States. So this is both a positive and a negative aspect. In the one sense, in order for a company to exist for 150 years, it must continuously grow and prosper and become better. And it also becomes more stable and less prone to system shocks of the whole economy as a whole. On the other hand, it also gives them more power, and it gives them the ability to do all kinds of things that theoretically they should be able to be the benign manipulator, as Edward Bernays said, imperceptibly moving the masses towards conscious decisions which were positive. And he did have some positive campaigns. He did help to produce propaganda for various kinds of vaccines. He claimed that he was interested in bringing ethics to the profession, but because the profession had to systematically go underground and rename itself public relations and advertising and all these different terms, it was very difficult for propaganda to ever grow a true ethical body. One of the most famous things that Edward Bernays did, whoa, okay, so before I go into this, how do you create a situation where the supply is the creation of demand? And this goes directly into being able to continuously grow bigger and bigger and continuously having more money to put into an effective new propaganda campaign. But what is new propaganda? So, as I mentioned earlier, old advertising was, this is a product, it is good, you need this product, please buy it. And new advertising is very different. As we stated in the public opinion episode, you do not see something and then have a conception of it. You have a conception of something and then you see it. So this is effectively the existence of new propaganda within our society. The seeding of conceptions in order to get someone to want something without telling them to go out and to buy it. One of the most successful campaigns of Edward Bernays, which is still in full effect today, I think a lot of people probably don't know where this comes from, but is bacon and eggs for breakfast. It's a hearty meal, right? Well, the Porkbelly companies around 1900 came, or sometime between World War I and 1930, contacted Edward Bernays, and they told him that they were going through a shock and they needed desperately to get more people to eat more bacon. And they weren't sure how to do that, how to properly advertise it. So he came in and he told them that they were looking at it the wrong way. People tend to, the doctors in society were getting much more prestige as different kinds of medical advances and as different kinds of practices were coming more into vogue. And people tended to listen to their doctors as experts in the medical field and in how to become healthy. So Edward Bernays got a panel of doctors to give national speaking tours and open press conferences about the heartiness and the wholesomeness of bacon and why it would be an excellent jolt to any morning breakfast to include bacon on it. So Edward Bernays did not create a situation where he told enough people to buy a product to get them to do so. Edward Bernays created an emotional response out of people who thought, this is my doctor knows what's best for me. I need to do what's best for me. Therefore, I need to eat bacon. And as silly as that might sound, that is literally in America where the conception of eating the kind of bacon that we eat in the morning comes from. It was a very effective propaganda campaign. So much so that it's still in full force today. And this is what Edward Bernays was trying to say. It may not sound like a huge deal that a man came into a company and changed the way that a lot of people thought to get them to eat something different for breakfast. And in the grand scheme of things, it's really not. And this was what he believed was the extent of propaganda. He thought that people were fickle and that groups, while malleable in a group, did not stay that way. And what was a fad now could very easily become gone in the very near future. And that you could imperceptibly move people towards certain things, and if the benefit for that thing was high enough, it could become ingrained in society, and if it was not, it would probably end up getting replaced by something else, especially in very competitive industries. This was not shared by a lot of other theorists, and various people who experienced the total effect of the propaganda in World War I went to other countries, especially take a country like the USSR. They saw the way that a total system of information could be used to control a population to do something that wasn't in their interest and that was extremely deadly. and they attempted to create the propaganda of the new Soviet man. And the new Soviet man did not think like the old man who had been around for 100,000 years, a million years. He was completely different. And the only reason why was because there was a small cabal of people at the top imperceptibly trying to manipulate the way that they think and their emotional responses to different stimuli. This did not work. And as it began to fail more and more, and as people realized that they were only allowed to think certain things and that they were not safe to speak, it came to bring a large apparatus for repression, and this was the end state of what was believed to be the ability to control the mass mind, which arguably isn't really something that exists to begin with. So, propaganda is not the total control of a large group of people by a small group, because that actually doesn't work. But propaganda is the limited control of a large group of people for some direct goal or purpose. It is an element of strategy and the weaving of a narrative that evokes an emotional response through propaganda will become an incredibly important topic as we head further into politics and social movements in the 20th century. But I just wanted to point out here what the effective uses of propaganda were, what the ineffective uses of propaganda were, and how this concept of the mass mind, which still sort of exists today, has actually been fairly proven to not be a real thing and to be a much less than effective way to control and coerce a large population. One other thing that I just want to say about Edward Bernays to show something a little bit more sinister that he did, which was also in the lines of propaganda, and how social movements can be manipulated by large organizations for private gain, was around the time that Edward Bernays was doing these various things, there was the suffragette movement. And a cigarette company came to Mr. Bernays and they said, women don't smoke enough cigarettes. They're like 10 or 15% of our total consumption. They just don't like it. We got to do something about that. We need to continuously grow, and this is the market that we need to break into. And Bernays said, okay, well, you can't just tell them to do it, but women are, at this point in time, taking a lot of decisions for themselves. So you don't tell these women to smoke more cigarettes. You tell them that they're not allowed to smoke more cigarettes. And there was various marches going on in Chicago and New York City and other areas for suffragettes and for the rights of women to vote. And Edward Bernays contacted several of the key leaders in these groups and handed them packs of cigarettes and told them that while they were flaunting the rules of men and the way of life that the men had told them that they were allowed to live, that they should take up their torches of freedom, because men had told them that they were not allowed to smoke cigarettes because it was a man's endeavor. And this worked. They walked up and down New York City and Chicago and Detroit smoking their torches of liberty, and from that moment forward, women came to be about half, much closer to the amount of, to the proportion of men that were smoking. And again, it wasn't that all of a sudden there was a spike in demand and so the supply had to be boosted up. There was an excess supply that needed to be moved. And so a group of people that was specifically targeted to increase sales was emotionally manipulated into believing this concept. There's one other thing that I want to leave out there. This is going to go a little bit longer than I thought it was, but around last year, there was this news story that was blowing up where this mother took her daughter to a store. And the daughter was upset because the toy that she wanted, like an action figure or something, wasn't advertised specifically to little girls. And the mother told her to write a letter, and she wrote a letter saying that she was upset that this company wasn't properly attempting to manipulate her emotionally into buying something that she didn't need. And it was all over the news of this heartwarming story about this large company acting on behalf of this little girl. And I just want to point out that this is extremely similar, if not the exact same thing as an effective propaganda model. These large companies may have seen that they weren't selling, or that they had a glut of these toys, or that they needed to continuously up their production and they needed to break into new markets. And this little girl being upset that there wasn't a specific toy that she wanted, evoking an emotional response within her to get her to buy something which she absolutely didn't need, is exactly the kind of propaganda campaign that you see that demonstrates supply driving the demand. Alright, well, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. This one was a little bit shorter. There wasn't really a whole lot to say about propaganda without going too far into making calls on whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's actually a very straightforward topic. One important thing is just to realize that it is supposed to be a neutral term. It can be used in multiple ways, and it's not effective at controlling large groups of people for large amounts of time on large ideas. So, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, why don't you leave a like? If you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. But until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.